Welcome back, Tolkien Fanatics, to the first actual episode of this series on breaking down the different match play guide scenarios. So, like I talked about in my little intro series video, I will be breaking down all 18 of them, and what better one to start with than scenario number 1 itself, Domination. So, Domination hails from the pool to the hold objective scenario. So my goal for this is to go over a quick outline of how to set the board up, some of the VPs, ways to score VPs, key points, and then some strategies and final thoughts that I've thought of. So I do want to give a quick shout out. This goes to Elliot Shillingshaw. Elliot has been following my channel now for a while, and he and I have been talking, and he has been asking for this, and he is a new player. So welcome to the community, Elliot. Glad you and I have had some good chats. It's been a blast. He has said that he has looked high and low and has not been able to find a lot of content specifically talking about the different scenarios. So I thought, well, that's a good point. That's something good that we should look into trying to do. So that is my goal for this scenario, or for this series, I'm sorry, is to go ahead and provide the content that is being looked for. So going ahead and starting right into it, like I said, we're going to be covering the Domination scenario. So basically, Domination, it's a fight to control 5 objectives across the board. The board is split into halves for deployment zone. That's pretty easy. The big key for this is where are the objectives going to be. So you roll a dice, you and your opponent, higher dice roll gets to pick. The central objective is automatically placed in the middle. The other 2 objectives, well, that's the first objective is automatically placed in the middle, and it will be the central objective. The other 2 objectives are placed by the players, and that's what your dice roll is for. The higher player gets to set the first of his 2 objectives anywhere on the board, as long as they are 12 inches away from another objective and at least 6 inches from a board edge. So that is crucial. So you can't try and put one like kitty corner, because if you try to put it 6 inches from the corner, it's not going to be 6 inches away from a board edge. So that is important, that you have to be fully away 6 inches from a board edge. Now my recommendation is to try and get 40mm tokens or poker chips. Poker chips are easy to come by. Almost every gas station, well, okay, I won't say gas station, we'll say convenience store. Drugstore and convenience store probably has a set of poker chips for like $10. You can get like a set of 50 for. Very simple to use, pretty universally standardly used. I don't recommend using 25mm bases. That's why I said 40mm, because what you'll usually see is about a 40mm object, like a poker chip. So if you come to one of my events, that's what I will be using actually, is I have a 100-piece clay poker chip set, and that's what I use. So moving along, the first player, the highest rolling player, going back to that, sets his first objective. The other player sets his first, and then they alternate back and forth until they're all set. Basically, you get to do it twice. After this is done, then you roll another dice. Now, the highest rolling player here gets to pick board sides. Now, this is important because you set your objectives before board sides are picked. So technically, when you're setting your objective, even though you're standing on one side of the table, you don't have to set your objective on your board half. The board halves have not yet been decided as you set the objectives. So this can be very important due to the fact that if you try to play a little bit of a defensive game, you can definitely fit 3 objectives on one side of the board, and then still have the middle objective. I will say I have played this before. Works better, obviously, with a high defense army. So you're looking at like a Minas Tirith shield wall, or you're looking at especially Iron Hill shield wall. Iron Hills with a ballista would love this, because then you can deploy back, just sit near the objectives, grab points that way, and then you rain the ballista down. Now that tactic won't work forever due to the fact that since it is a 24-inch deployment zone, your opponent is going to be able to get on top of you within a turn or 2, depending on where you put yourself in your own deployment zone. Okay? So that's something to bring up. So going along, like I said, the objective of the game is to control the objective markers. That is achieved by having at least one friendly model and no enemy models within 3 inches of the objective, or greater friendly models than enemy models. Now, a lot of people ask, how do you measure it? Do you measure from the center of the objective? Do you measure from the edge of the objective? How do you measure? My recommendation, because this is how I judge, is from the edge of the token. And that's why I say use a 40 millimeter token, because universally 40 millimeters is usually pretty common. So you can decide to do it however you would prefer amongst your gaming group. Just make sure that you guys always play that way. And be in mind, or keep in mind, that if you go to an event, ask the TO beforehand, hey, if we have this scenario, Breakthrough is another one where, just like Domination, I have to be within 3 inches. Are you measuring from the center of the objective token, or are you measuring from the outer diameter? So every TO will do it differently. Some TOs do the center, some TOs do the outside, some TOs use small 25 millimeter tokens or less. It all depends on the TO. All right. So like I said, if you come to one of my events here in the US, I will be using poker chips, and I will be measuring from the outer diameter of the poker chip. That is where my 3 inches is. So you kind of actually, I give you a little bit extra there, you know. So be happy for that. Moving along, that's pretty much everything in terms of the outline, the layout, starting positions, and the objective. So the game ends when one team has been reduced to a quarter. This is a scenario where you are going to score the majority of your points around your objectives. You do get points for leader runes and breaking, but not nearly as much as other scenarios. Your goal is to try and go and get those objective markers. You score the majority of your victory points by controlling those objective markers, and you score more if you fully control them and have no enemies around them. So it's worth double to have an objective marker with no enemies around it. That can be hard to do because, like I said, that 3 inches, it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you've got a lot of, especially if you're fighting against a horde army, yeah, that can be tough. That can be very, very tough. So if you are a horde army, though, you like this scenario because then you're just going to go ahead and bleh, so to speak. You probably enjoy a defensive situation like I was talking about earlier, other than the elite armies with the high, or the not elite armies, but the elite defense armies. Horde armies probably like this scenario as well, just due to the fact that they would be able to deploy back. Oh, excuse me, man, I'm tired. I always get tired and yawn during these. You'd think I'd be awake. No. But anyway, horde armies, they would probably enjoy sitting back on top of the objectives as well, like I was saying earlier. Especially if they can get some shooting in. That being said, if you're a horde army like, say, Hobbits or Uruk-hai Scouts, because Uruk-hai Scouts, in my opinion, can be pretty hoarded. I'm looking specifically at the Legendary Legion Alerts Scouts, which has high mobility for one, and then you can get a lot of models in, especially because depending on how you load yourself out with drums and banners. I personally try to get 2 banners in if it's like an 800-point event. But if it's something lower than that, I take 1 and then use the extra points from that second banner to try and get troops. But you can get in the 60s to 70s depending on how you want to break that. And that easily could be considered a small horde. Now, that being said, if you're fighting against an army like an Iron Hills, you're going to have to be careful because especially if that Iron Hills has a ballista, they might just sit back and shoot at you all game and whittle you down until you break and then start fleeing due to courage checks before moving in to grab the objectives. So be very careful about who you're playing against and how. Hobbits are another one. And I said Hobbits first, I think, along with Uruk-hai Scouts, Lurtz's Legendary Legion again. Because those bows are only 18-inch orc bows. Same for the Hobbits. The Hobbit bow is only 18 inches. So while you could get a lot in there, I mean, if you're talking about a 60 model list, excluding heroes for scouts, you're talking about 20 scout bows if you max out. Hobbits, easily 100 plus models, 33 bows. But again, that 18 inches, and it's even worse for Hobbits because moving 4 inches, if somebody's sitting at their 24-inch range, you can move your full 4 inches, and they can just sit there and kite you. So you got to be real careful how you do that. Sometimes, as crazy as it sounds, you're almost better being those slow-moving hobbits assaulting a position than trying to hold it. Now you can play it too where you hold the position and then send a bunch of your hobbits at the opponent, make the opponent have to move around. You never know. You might be able to get a whole hammer and anvil thing where they try and slip past you, and then when they do, boom, you just drop your hobbits that are sitting back and pinch them in. So be careful of that. Movement armies like this scenario, but at the same time they dislike it. You have a lot of mobility with movement armies. I'm looking at pure Rohan because that's one of my favorites, especially the Legendary Legion of Théoden's Riders. That, in my opinion, is one of the best Legendary Legions, and definitely the best for Rohan. Uh, I don't play Rohan any other way than that Legendary Legion, and it's just got a lot of hitting power, a lot of weapons, and a lot of little buffs that just make it great. Kind of helps add some things that Rohan needed. But anyway, it's a great army. The thing is that usually at the 800 point range, I'm in that 26 to 28 model range, depending on heroes and throwing spear loadout that I take for my models. That's great when you can get a full charge off, but it can be hard to do if you're trying to grab objectives in an objective scenario game. This is one, though, where if you get your opponent close to being 25%ed, you can just run a horsey over and grab an objective. So it's not like capture and control, which is another hold objective scenario where once your opponent is broken, you or your opponent are broken, you start taking, the random dice roll to see if a gain ends. And I will say I have lost a capture and control due to the fact that I broke my opponent too quickly and then rerolled a 1 and the scenario ended and I had 2 objectives to his 3. But that's not this scenario. So this scenario is 25%. So if you're playing an evil army with a high mobility army, Khand is another great one for high mobility. And you can break your opponent in a turn or two, especially with a great turn of death from Théoden's Riders, since I mentioned them already, or your chariots for Khand, just getting in there and plowing things over. Or one that people don't think about but is really good, the Iron Hills Chariot can do a lot of damage, especially if you use the Captain's Point of Might to do a march and just move 11 inches through your opponent. That's another really good one. So, yeah. One to be careful of, I know a lot of people may be thinking, yeah, Mooboks are that way too. They got 4. Well, that's great, but the guys in the Moomok, you have to measure from their bases all the way up in that howdah down. And I can guarantee you they are more than 3 inches outside. They are not within 3 inches of that central objective. It's not like a barrier where it stretches up. It is base to base. So, yeah, you could run a Moomok through a whole bunch of guys and be sitting right on top of an objective. But if all those guys in the howdah, they're not within 3 inches of that objective marker. So you better have some repelling lines to get down, or you're going to be jumping and taking a lot of, strength 2 or strength 3 falling damage hits, something like that. But yeah, so I'm not a big Moomok fan anyway, just because of that in particular. Yeah, you can get a lot of guys in one Moomok, so to speak, but for an objective scenario like this, it kind of screws you. So be careful of that if you are a Moomok player. I'm not telling you not to be. They are cool models, and they do some really cool things. They do have several weaknesses, though, and they do have several scenario weaknesses, this one being one of them. So, moving on. I talked about movement armies, some horde armies, high defense. Again, this isn't really a scenario where you're caring too much about killing the enemy leader. If you can just kind of tie him up, that's great. Yes, there are some VPs involved with that, but not nearly as many as there are in other scenarios. And then breaking, again, very few VPs. This scenario is all about going and getting the objective. So, yeah. That's pretty much everything I'm going to hit on, I think. I think I've talked about a lot. We're getting close to that 15-minute mark, which is where I want to keep these to. So just a couple final thoughts. This is a scenario that has become less common in events because capture and control is considered to be a more balanced scenario. So you do see capture and control more likely than domination. That being said, it is a scenario you have to plan for, and it is still. I say it's less common, but it's still common. If you get what I mean, like if you're going to a 2-day event that's 5 or 6 rounds, this one or capturing control is most likely going to be in there. I would say 60-40 capturing control to domination. It depends on what the local meta is, and we won't even get into that. And it also depends on the TO. So, like me personally, I prefer capturing control, but I change it up sometimes to put domination in there because it's a fun one. And then lastly, the biggest thing to remember is that the objective markers go down before you roll to see what table side you're picking. So think about how your army plays and that should help determine where your objective markers go. Are you an aggressive army or are you a defensive army? Are you a high mobility army? Get after your opponent, run them into the ground. Well, maybe you want to try and pick the side where, try and get the objective markers to one side so that you can just run in there and run your opponent to the ground and break them and get them to start failing courage checks and then hop on objectives. Or are you an Iron Hills, slow, 5-inch moving, plodding along, defense 8 guy who doesn't give a darn rat's behind about getting shot at with strength 2 bows? So maybe that's one where it's like, okay, I want to be on the side that has more objectives. So just remember, they got to be 12 inches away, 6 inches from a board edge, and you're going to get most of your VPs by controlling those objectives, either by A, having more models than your opponent, or B, having models and your opponent doesn't at all. And that latter one is what you really are looking for. Okay, guys, thanks for watching. I hope this helps you guys find some strategies, open some doors for thought processes. As always, if you have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe. Help me beat those damn YouTube algorithms, those screw bags from YouTube like to bury videos if you're not over 1,000 subscribers and stuff like that. So help me out by just hitting that like, share, and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. Plus, it'll help me get my content to you faster because it'll actually pop up in your feed. But until next time, guys, take care and enjoy Tolkien's Legendarium in all its extremities.